2185, Roses and Ashes. Nothing, Arizona Main Street, 2185.03.04, 0700. Rose Patterson walked into what had once been nothing, Arizona. The town had been wrecked during World War III, but in the 2060, people had begun to move into the ghost town again. Why they hadn't done so before that date was lost to history. Not that these new versions of the town had lasted very long, but they had resulted in the town becoming a mix of ruins and abandoned structures. There were tents, yurts, wooden cabins, and plenty of other sorts of homes. The reason settlers out here tended not to last long was simple. Nothing was located in the desert, which made a perfect test site for Patterson and her people. Born in Ireland 42 years ago, Rose was the lead scientist for Team Bravo 2. Her team was a research unit for an agency called Terraform Command. The agency had been founded in 2161 by merging the terraforming agencies of the Federation's founding members. So her team was a mix of humans, Vulcans, Andorians, and Tellarites. Rose reached her destination, a large tent that was serving as the team's headquarters. She stepped inside and tried to shake the dust from her black hair, then made her way to a large table in the center of the tent. The table held a large map of the area. Her second-in-command, a Vulcan male called Pharaohs, was studying the map. "How are we doing, Pharaohs?" "Commander," Pharaohs was retired Starfleet officer, and it was noticeable in his manners. "We have placed the equipment, but there has been a complication." He pointed to a spot on the map. "There is an uncharted cave at these coordinates. I recommend we fill it before proceeding, ma'am." "How big are we talking?" The Vulcan didn't answer, but handed her a pad. It had a drawing of the cave with measurements. "That will take a LOT of material to fill." But she agreed with Pharaohs. Even if it didn't hinder their efforts, leaving it as it was would come back to bite them if people did resettle nothing after they were done. Fortunately, Rose already had an idea. "Get me Team Delta 5. "Yes, ma'am." Pharaohs went to the communications console to make the call, while Rose talked to Lexington Lex McDonald Zhukov. The son of a Scottish mother and a Russian father, Lex was 25 years old with blue eyes and short blonde hair. Rose had drafted him to become chief engineer for her team 2 years ago. Her conversation with Lex was ended by Pharaohs announcing that her comlink was ready. Rose gave Lex a nod and went to the communications console. On the screen was an African-American human female with short hair and blue eyes. The hair was painted. As for her eyes, the woman had been born blind. But during her childhood, it turned out that her defect could be surgically corrected. The surgery had been successful. Its only side effect had been that her eyes had become blue. The woman's name was Rose Morrow. This Rose led Team Delta 5. Her team was assigned to South Africa, where they tried to turn abandoned mines and farmland. "Rose," Patterson said, "enjoying South Africa." =/==, I'm having a good time. "How are things in Arizona?" =/==. "We're just getting started. One wee problem. There's a cave here that wasn't on the map, and we need to fill it." =/==, let me guess. You wanted to know if I had any leftover topsoil from the old mines I'm working on. =/==. I think that would do the job. =/==, I'll see what I can do. =/==. Thank you, Bravo 2 out. Morrow's face was replaced by the Terraform Command logo, and then the screen went black. Well, Rose, time to get work. She turned away from the console and headed back to the table. There was work to be done. Earth, South Africa, Cape Town Spaceport. Platform 2 2185.04.04, 0800. Rose Morrow stood on a balcony overlooking Platform 2. Below, the SS Nautilus was being loaded. Launched in 2103, the J-class freighter was considered an outdated rust bucket these days. But Terraform Command couldn't afford to be picky, and it always got the job done. It turned out that the government of South Africa had plenty of mining topsoil it wanted to get rid of. So this was a nice chance to kill two birds with one stone. "She'll hold together, ma'am," a female voice said. Tirana was a Vulcan female. She had been in command of the Nautilus since it had been transferred to Terraform Command in 2161. "We should be able to deliver several shipments before the end of the day." "Then I won't keep you any longer, Captain." Tirana gave her a nod and left to board her ship. 5 minutes later, the Nautilus lifted off and pulled away. As she watched the ship go, Morrow wondered how come the map of nothing had not been accurate. Normally, the cartographers were frightfully good at their jobs. Tilda still. Everybody can have an off day. Tilda, she gave the platform one last look and then headed for the nearest transporter room. Nothing. Arizona Main Street, 2186.1, 7.09, 1225. The cave had been filled in, and so had been a large chunk of the old mine. South Africa had provided a lot of soil and tons of rocks. On the surface, the terraforming was slowly beginning to take hold. Grass was starting to grow, and they had planted a couple of trees, which had managed not to die. But that was only the start. Getting the terraforming to take root, metaphorically speaking, would take years. For now, however, they had done what they could. The rest of the work would be done by the machines. So for now, they were packing up and getting ready to move on. At the moment, however, they were all having lunch. Rose and Lex were sitting in the remains of a house that had been turned into a makeshift mess hall. Even after months, it's still weird to be sitting in what had once been somebody else's living room. The mess hall was like a phoenix that had risen out of the ashes of the old house. "Lex, have you ever wondered who used to live here?" "Aye," McDonald Zhukov said, "but there's not much left of what was here before. Maybe we should leave some of our stuff behind, just to pester future generations." They both chuckled at that. At that moment, Pharaohs came into the mess hall. Pharaohs had been overseeing the packing of the command tent. It was always the first thing to be put up and usually the last thing to be broken down. "Pharaohs, how are we doing?" "All the other equipment is packed, Commander," Pharaohs said. "Once we break down the mess hall tent, the Nautilus will be ready to relocate the camp, ma'am. Take the equipment and the tables, but leave the tent." Pharaohs simply nodded in acknowledgement and left to make it happen, while Rose turned back to Lex. "What? We don't know, it's almost worn out, and we have 2 spares gathering dust amongst the supplies. And it'll pester future generations. And it'll pester future generations." The two of them finished their meal and then left the tent. Lex went to make sure that all the gear was properly secured aboard the Nautilus, while Rose went for one last walk around the town. She was on her way to the Nautilus when she heard a noise. Following her ears, she found a lizard sitting in one of the burned-out houses. The animal simply looked at her. She recognized it as a desert iguana. Tilda, a young one, not very big. Tilda since figured it was about 20 centimeters from its snout to the tip of its tail. "You know, if we succeed in this whole terraforming thing, your home will be gone." The lizard simply kept looking at her. "You want to come?" She carefully approached the animal and picked it up. "Come on, Ashes, it's time to go." The two of them headed for the Nautilus. It was time to leave nothing, Arizona, behind. To be continued. 2245, Tango. Nothing. Arizona Field, outside town, 2245.05.01, 0730. Captain Tivorall landed her shuttle and stepped out. Her shuttle was surrounded by grass and trees. It was a far cry from how things had been around here when her parents had met. Her father was called Pharaohs, and her mother was Captain Tirana. Pharaohs had replaced Rose Patterson as leader of Team Bravo 2 after she had retired. And Tirana had been promoted to command of the SS Achilles, a Class 4 star drive vessel. As for Tivorall, She had followed in her father's footsteps and joined Starfleet. She had ascended the ranks to command of the USS Halsey, a Ranger-class explorer ship. Launched in 2218, the Halsey was getting close to being 30 years old, which meant that she was long overdue for a refit. A situation that Starfleet Command had finally decided to correct. And while the ship was getting overhauled, T-Voral and her crew were on shore leave. She had requested a temporary assignment to bridge the gap, but Command had turned her request down, so here she was. She had always been curious about this place. She walked into the town and was surprised to find it inhabited. There were all sorts of structures around the place. Their ages varied greatly. The center of the settlement was a large tavern called the Old Tent. It was called that because that was exactly what it was. Tilda the tent Bravo 2 left behind. Tilda she entered the tent to find a disorganized collection of tables. The tables were filled by a mix of species some T-Voral didn't even recognize. A makeshift bar was where the patrons collected their drinks. As she reached it, she realized that the locals were still using money. Tilda if you use a wide definition of the word money. Tilda while some paid with gold-pressed latinum, there was also plenty of other currencies on the bar. Tilda those look like Klingon darsecs. Tilda, and all different sorts of payment. The collection included a bottle of Romulan ale, pieces of technology, jewelry, and a lot more. When she had entered, the bar had been a noisy affair. But now it was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The barkeep, a very large Klingon, was the one who broke the silence. "What can I do for you, Captain?" "How many?" She searched her pockets and pulled out a medallion. "Refreshments can I purchase with this?" She handed the medallion to the Klingon. It was a St. Christopher medallion she had received from her communications officer Quincy de Salle when he had retired yesterday. That was when the Halsey had entered dry dock. Not a religious person, T-Voral was not attached to it. The Klingon finished his examination of the medallion. "I'll give you 3 drinks." The only seat left was one of several stools at the bar, so that was where T-Voral sat down. "So, can I get you, Captain?" "Tea, please." The Klingon nodded. As he went to see about her drink, the noise returned to the bar. The barkeep returned with Vulcan mint tea. Tilda, where did he get Vulcan mint? Tilda she could ask him, but this establishment was far from legal. And doing so would have been as Commander de Salle would have put it poking the bear. "So, what brings a Vulcan Starfleet captain to my bar?" "My parents met here during the terraforming process." She sipped her tea. "Why is a Klingon running a bar?" "Because one of my ancestors was an idiot. He got my family discommended 4 generations ago. I can never return to the Klingon Empire, nor can my children and grandchildren. So I had to find another way to make a living, and here I am. My really name is unimportant. Everybody calls me Tango. I am T-Voral, captain of USS Halsey." "Welcome to nothing, Captain." T-Voral nodded and continued drinking her tea. Something told her that her visit to nothing would be fascinating. Nothing. Arizona, the Old Tent, 2245.06.01, 0805. Tango's real name was Daros, son of Kavok. He had tried living in the Empire under his real name, but his people were not very forgiving towards those who had suffered discommendation. This was true even generations from the event. Here, he had been able to vanish. Well, maybe. He had spent more of yesterday playing tour guide to the female Vulcan captain. She had left around sunset. Tilda, and if she reported us to Starfleet Command, that could have been our last sunset. Tilda, but only time would tell if she had. Right now, he was busy sorting yesterday's haul and keeping an eye on the customers. Not that he expecting them to run out without paying. Instead, he was watching them because of the games. 3 tables were busy with board games, and 2 were playing poker. While the board games rarely caused trouble, cheating was popular amongst the poker players. And when discovered, this tended to start bar fights. On the bright side, The broken tables and chairs that were usually the result kept the local woodcarvers in business. He had just locked away the money when 6 Starfleet people entered the tent. They were a mix of races and departments, but oddly enough, all of them were enlisted personnel. As Tango reached for the disruptor he kept under the bar, he wondered why Starfleet hadn't sent any officers to shut them down. And none of them were armed. Tilda, stay calm, Darrows. Tilda, as the 6 of them approached the bar, he kept his hand on the disruptor. Then the one in the lead, a female human chief petty officer, put a large crystal on the bar. Got room for 6 more. Tilda, what? Tilda, he blinked away his surprise while moving his hand away from his weapon. He checked the crystal. It was Promethean quartz. Tilda, well, that's a second new thing in less than a minute. Tilda, Prometheus was a Class M world, but nobody seemed to know who exactly lived there and where it was. Getting a piece of their quartz was not an easy feat. Name your poison. He took the Starfleet people's drink orders, and they went to find themselves a place to sit. As he prepared the drinks, he realized that nothing's fate had indeed been changed, just not in the way he had been expecting. Now all he could do was wait to see how long his luck would hold. Nothing. Arizona, the old tent, 2245.2, 5.12, 1205. Tango didn't understand the holiday that humans called Christmas one bit, but it was good for business. In fact, it would normally take 4 weeks to make what he made on Christmas Day. Especially now that the old tent had become a regular dive bar for Starfleet enlisted personnel. At first, he had expected trouble with the newcomers, but they had joined the mix of customers without any hiccups. They also liked a good bar fight. The place was packed to the rafters, so he had been forced to hire staff to help. He had assigned John, a human male, to cover the bar so that he could clean glasses. The rest of his new hires were busy playing waiter. He had just begun working on a fresh batch of glasses and plates when John turned to him. "Boss, you have a visitor." He dried his hands and turned to see T-Voral standing at the bar. Oddly enough, she was not wearing her Starfleet uniform. Tilda, and she is not looking well. Tilda, not that he knew exactly what looking well looked like on a Vulcan, but he figured it was what she had looked like during her first visit. "Captain T-Voral, what brings you back to my bar?" "It is a private matter." John and Tango exchanged looks, but neither said anything. Tango walked around the bar and left the tent with T-Voral. Before he could ask her what was wrong, she pulled him close and kissed him. Tilda, so that's what wrong with her. Tilda, he had heard all sort of rumors about how some things worked for Vulcans. He was about to find out what was true and what was made up. Nothing. Arizona, the old tent, 2245.2, 6.12, 0937. Tango had spent the rest of day with T-Voral. At the end of it, her problem had been over. John had managed to keep the place running, so he had paid John double the pay he had originally been promised. Now, Tango was doing the post-Christmas cleanup. As he cleaned up, ashes scuttled through the mess. Nobody remembered where the tradition of having a desert iguana called Ashes came from. But it had already been around when Tango had taken over the old tent 3 years ago. The Ashes that had been there when he had taken over had died after a year, but the town council had gotten him a new lizard. I know. Why would a Vulcan want a Klingon?" he said. "It's weird. But then again, weird is just another average day in this town." He continued cleaning up. Tilda, don't Vulcans have arranged marriages or something? Tilda, his uncle had once said something about that, but he couldn't remember the details. Tilda, focus, Darrows, focus. Tilda, he turned his attention back to cleaning up the mess. After he finished, he fed Ashes and opened the tent. There were already people waiting outside, so he let them in and got to work. USS Halsey Sickbay, 2246.0, 2.02, 0903. Halsey had finished her refit yesterday. She was now on her way to Sector 31 to patrol the Romulan neutral zone. The ship's maximum cruising speed had been increased from Warp 3 to Warp 4, so the trip would be a lot shorter than it would have been before the refit. Still, there would be plenty of time to pass. So the Halsey's chief medical officer, Dr. Yorick Williams, was ordering everybody to come in for their physicals. On her way in, T. Vorall passed Lieutenant Junior Grade T. Gara, who gave her a polite nod. The captain returned the gesture, but had to suppress a pang of loss. T. Gara was fresh out of the academy, but had done so well in her studies that she had been assigned as DeSalle's replacement. Then Williams cleared his throat, making her turn her attention back to the matter at hand. "Please sit on the bed, Captain," Williams said. T. Vorall sat on one of the biobeds, and Williams began scanning her. She had a suspicion what he would find. It had been several months since she had suffered her pon farr. T. Vorall had considered going back to Vulcan, but then she would have revealed why she was going on home. And even if she lied, she didn't have a mate. So she would have had to gone to the temple at Mount Celia, where there are monks and sisters who dealt with such situations. But they kept records for medical reasons. So she had gone to Tango, knowing that he would keep her secret. She also didn't know if Klingon and Vulcans could have children at the time. But recently, her body had been giving her signals that she was pregnant. This was why she was not surprised when Williams double-checked his readings and ran another scan. "You are healthy, Captain," he paused, "and pregnant, ma'am." "Is the child healthy?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do you require any more tests?" "No, ma'am." Williams pushed several buttons on the tricorder to check something. "Do you wish to know the gender, ma'am?" "I do." "You child will be female, ma'am." "May I go now?" "Yes, ma'am." T. Vorall jumped off the bed and walked out. As she headed back to the bridge, the news finally hit home. Soon, she would be the mother of Klingon Vulcan child. The news would shook her parents, and there was also the fact of raising the child. Tilda, a Starfleet ship, is no place for children. Tilda, she considered sending the child to her parents, but she would, as the humans would put it, stick out like a sore thumb. Instead, she would have to send her to her father. She wondered how her would respond to the news. But then the turbolift reached the bridge, and she had to get back the here and now. 2302, Rusty Bucket. Nothing. Arizona Main Street, 2302.07.08, 0819. Sayara, daughter of Tango and T. Vorall, was the current owner of the old tent. Her father had won a bar in Las Vegas in a poker game 6 years ago. Alas, the current version was not the original one. The original old tent had burned down 8 years ago. So these days, the bar was in a collection of converted shipping containers. Another thing that had changed was that the old tent was no longer a one-person setup. These days, there were 4 other people on the payroll. One was the cook, 1 washed dishes, and 2 were waiters. This freed Sayara to cover the bar and cash register. And of course, there was a corner where the latest ashes spend his time. She entered the bar to find her people already hard at work. "Morning, boss," said John Tripp, who was busy cleaning the tables. John's last name wasn't really Tripp. In fact, nobody knew what his really last name was. But his grandfather had been the John who had taken care of the bar while Sayara's parents had been spending the night together. A couple of years later, John had met a nice girl and become John Sr. And John Jr. had met another nice girl, resulting in John III, who everybody called John Tripp, short for John Triple. "Morning, John." Sayara took her place and got to work. Tilda another day in nothing. Tilda it was as any other day in this place, but that was fine with her. Live in nothing was good, and she hoped that wouldn't change for the foreseeable future. Las Vegas Spaceport, launching pad 52302.07.08, 0930. The SS Rusty Bucket was exactly as it said on the label. She was the oldest, most badly maintained, miserable old ship in all of the North America. And her captain, a human called Brewster McKinley, was the dirtiest, crankiest, laziest person to skipper a ship ever. At least, in the opinion of Inspector Carl Schlitt. How this man was still flying this horrible ship was beyond him. He was currently arguing the point with his boss, Paul Hood. Hood was the spaceport's manager, and he was ordering Schlitt to clear the Rusty Bucket for launch. "That ship is a disaster waiting to happen," Schlitt was yelling into his radio headset. =//= I know. Which is why I want it out of my spaceport. Now clear the blasted thing. =//=. Schlitt sighed and cursed. Then he contacted the Rusty Bucket and gave McKinley his clearance. The man grumbled something Schlitt couldn't make out, then cut the connection. Second later, the Rusty Bucket's maneuvering thrusters fired and the ship lifted off. As the vessel departed, Schlitt wondered what kind of ship the Rusty Bucket had been. It had probably originally been an Andorian freighter. But over the years, so many bits and pieces had been added and replaced that was practically unrecognizable. Then his radio activated as the next ship asked for clearance to land. SS Rusty Bucket Cockpit 2302.07.08 0932. Brewster McKinley burped as he finished his beer and threw it over his shoulder. He missed the pile of beer cans behind his chair. Instead, it hit a fuse box in the back of the cockpit. McKinley was so drunk he didn't even notice as it shorted out. Instead, he pressed the buttons to fire up the impulse drive. There was slight pause, and then 2 of the control consoles exploded. The rest of the controls all went black, and the thrusters died. McKinley cursed as the Rusty Bucket started falling from the sky like a brick. As his adrenaline kicked in, his fingers flew across the board. He didn't have any crew, but there was an AI program called Misty keeping an eye on things in the engine room. Misty rerouted, something, and part of his controls came back online. He managed to get some of the thrusters working again, but it was not enough. The thrusters slowed the bucket down, but it was still falling. Pressing more buttons, he managed to level the ship out. 23 seconds later, the ship hit soil. It slid along, catching fire as she did so, then she slammed to a stop as she dug in. The last thing McKinley thought about before he passed out was that the load of chemicals he had been carrying would be a major problem. Then the world went black. Nothing. Arizona, the old tent, 2302.07.08 0935. One moment, Sayara had been behind the bar, the next moment she was flying through the air. The good news was that she landed with breaking anything. The bad news was that the old tent was pretty much totaled. "What the Grether was that?" John said as he crawled out from the remains of a table. "I have no idea," Sayara said. "We need to see about the others." All of the staff were still alive, but one of the waiters, a Bolian female called Loria, had broken her leg. Alas, 3 of the customers had not survived whatever had just happened. Sayara made her way to the entrance/exit, but the door was warped, so she had to break it down. There was a load crash as the door fell into the main street. They clambered out to find chaos. A large chunk of the town was on fire, and several buildings had been wrecked like the old tent had been. "It was a shockwave," Sayara said. "From what? A nuclear bomb?" "No way," Loria said. "We'd all be charcoal skeletons." "We'll figure it out later," Sayara said. "Let's get you to the clinic." John and Sayara carried Loria to the clinic. Fortunately, the clinic was on the far side from the town from whatever had just hit them. When they got there, the place was full of wounded, the staff running back and forth, treating people. One of the nurses directed them towards an empty bio bed. They sat Loria down on the bed, and the nurse set to treating Loria's leg. John jumped in to help the staff, while Sayara made her way through the chaos. The clinic was a 2-story building, so she made her way upstairs. There, she found the emergency ladder to the roof and climbed it. She figured that the roof would give her the best view of whatever had happened. Tilda Bloody Grether, A freighter had crashed just outside Nothing, cutting a nasty-looking gully behind it. That gully was filling with toxic-looking liquids leaking from the crashed freighter. The ship was not just leaking, it was also on fire. As for Nothing, as they had seen before, the buildings on the side of the town facing the crash were on fire. Then came a band of structures that had been wrecked by the shockwave. Finally, the rest of the town appeared to be fine for now. But if the freighter blew, Sayara figured that the explosion would push out a cloud of toxic that would kill everybody in town. Move Sayara, or this town is toast. She climbed back down the ladder. In the chaos of the clinic, nobody noticed as she grabbed a fire extinguisher. Then she bolted from the place and headed for the crash site. SS Rusty Bucket Cockpit 2302.07.08 0942. McKinley woke to a world that was on fire. The cockpit was buried deep underground, so escaping through the window was not an option, and the other side was a solid wall of flame. Cursing, he looked around and found the cockpit's fire extinguisher. He began spraying, but it only lasted 10 seconds before it ran out. Crap. As the fire creeped closer, he realized that this was the end. How did I end up here? But the truth was that knew the answer. He had always known the answer. His family had moved to Las Vegas after one of his ancestors, Mad Rick, had vanished somewhere in Arizona. They had never found even the slighted trace of the man. And ever since the move, the family had been cursed. Brewster had tried to escape the curse by drowning his sorrows. And now you are going to die for it, you drunken fool. There was nothing for him to do but watch as the flames approached. He closed his eyes and then... The cockpit filled with smoke as the fire was extinguished. Then a giant creature entered the cockpit. He wanted to scream, but the being grabbed him and dragged him out of the cockpit. Before he knew what was happening, he was outside the rusty bucket, or what was left of the rusty bucket. It was then that he realized that the creature was a female Klingon, but she had pointed ears. Klingon Vulcan, he had barely completed the thought when the world went black again. Nothing. Arizona Field, 2302.07.08 0948. Saria had made her way inside using her original fire extinguisher. Inside, she had found 2 more. Those, she had used to carve a path to the cockpit. Outside its hatch, she had found the one she had used to kill the fire inside the cockpit. But that had been the last one aboard the freighter. And things weren't getting better, because the chemicals were making the air around the freighter toxic. While the man she was carrying had been the only crew member on the freighter, the people of Nothing were still at risk. Especially if those chemicals makes it to the drinking water. Her instincts were telling her that the days of Nothing as she had known, it were numbered. Later. Nothing. Arizona Field, 2302.22.08 1132. The emergency services had arrived while Saria had been carrying the pilot to the clinic. They had gone to work dealing with the crisis right away. By the time the dust had settled, 73 people had been dead. The brass in Phoenix had given the order to evacuate the town. It had taken 2 days to move everybody to Las Vegas, but there was the wreckage of the rusty bucket and her chemical cargo to deal with. Saria's instincts had been right. The cargo had reached the groundwater, poisoning a massive area of the desert. Nothing was now the epicenter of a massive dead zone, which was where Captain Perrin came in. Perrin was an Andorian male who was in charge of one of Starfleet's environmental cleanup teams. His unit, Alpha 1, was assigned to cover sectors 001 and 002. It was a large unit. Counting Perrin, the team had 105 members. He had been gathering progress reports when his superior, Admiral Samuel Morris, had called for a status update. So he had left the work site to go answer the call. There was a small modular shelter that was home to their communications gear and several other pieces of equipment. Inside the shed, 4 officers were working. One was directing air traffic away around the most toxic areas. One was working the communications console, and the last two were studying soil samples. Perrin turned to Commander Tigara, his second-in-command, who doubled as Alpha One's communications officer. He nodded, and she opened the channel. Admiral Morris was an African-American man in his 50s, with graying hair and a warm smile. //= Captain Perrin, how is it going down there? //=. Well, it's a classic good news, bad news situation, sir. Perrin made a face. Which do you want first, sir? //= Start with the good news, Captain. //= We're making good progress on the removal of the wreckage and the filtering of the chemicals from the soil and the water. But that's where the good news ends. The bad news is that the damage is done. All the terraforming in this area is gone. Even with all the toxic elements removed, it's going to take decades for this area to get back to its original state. //= Blast. //= Morris took a deep breath. //= Okay, Captain, take it slow. We have all the time in the world to get this right. No mistakes and no casualties. Now get back to it, Morris out. //= The screen went black. Morris had given him a game plan. Tilde time to get to it. Tilde, so that was exactly what he did.